Shavua Tov. Today's daf is daf Nun Zayin, and we're going to begin with Tanu Rabbanan, which is 4 lines down from the top of the Yomi. Ben Bayan, the son of Bayan, apparently Bayan was a very good guy, and his son Nosan Peah Yerek. Now this was a mistake on the part of the son, because we don't give peah from Yerakos. There is no peah on vegetables because vegetables do not last very long. And one of the conditions that the Mishnah sets in peah for the chiyuv peah is that it's got to be nichnas l'kiyum. It's got to be something that machnisim oso l'kiyum, and it can last long. It can be preserved for a long time. So now it's very nice that the son of Bayan magnanimously wants to give peah to the aniyim from Yerakos, which he's not obligated to do. But there's a downside, and that's because peah is potter from Masechet. But if it's not peah, then you chayv in Masechet. And unbeknown to these aniyim, if they collect the peah that Ben Bayan left for them from Yerakos, they'll be eating tevel l'maseh. Ba'aviv, so Bayan himself comes along, mitzon la'aniyim shayuteunim yerek. He sees, and to no surprise, that the aniyim are collecting the yerakos that his son had left for them. And of course, he's very concerned about that because they don't know that they're chayiv in maseh. The omdim al pesach hagina, they're about to enter into his gina. Amalehem banai. He starts with a very nice, warm opening. Banai, my sons, because he wants to make sure that they realize that he's working in their best interest when he says to them, "Hashlichu me'alechem." Don't take this peah, and if you collect this peah, leave it here because there's no peah from Yerakos. And again, as we said before, he was afraid that they would eat the peah without being mafresh mas. He says, I'll give you double the amount for every single vegetable that you picked up and now you're willing to forfeit. I will give you 2 yerakos. As long as it's ma'usa, because we will be mafresh masif. And then he adds another statement. He says to them, Lo mipnei she'eni tzara. Don't think that I'm trying to kaviyachol rob you of that which is yours, and that I won't live up to my promise. El mipnei she'omru chachamim einostin peah liyerek. I'm a good guy. I'm honest. I'm good to my word. I will bring you kiflayim, twice that amount of peah, because the Chacham say there's no peah from Yerakos. And the Gemara explains, why did he feel compelled to add that statement and sort of clear his reputation and say that I'm not trying to rob you, I'm not stingy here? He was afraid that they might say the Aniyim, he's really just trying to steal our peah. He's pushing us off. He has no intention of giving us double the amount. So he went out of his way to defend himself even before their argument would come to the fore and claim, I'm not Eini Tzara. I'm not trying to, again, undermine your position and your rights to collect the pay. Tanu Rabbanan. Now we're about to start on a Gadita that'll take us till the end of the Perek, which is here on Daf and Zayin on the base. And this is a painful Agadita because it's going to reveal to us that although v'yamech kulam tzaddikim, we're all tzaddikim, but apparently there was quite a bit of evil going around at that time. And we're going to focus later on, as we'll see, on the period of Bayis Sheni, the second Bayis. Tanu Rabbanan, we learned in a Brayso, B'Rishona hayu menichim oros kadoshim b'lishkas beis haparva. Now the halacha is that the oros, the skins, the hides of the karbanos, were given and designated as a gift to the Kohanim. And there was a place right outside the Azara, which was a lishka that was dedicated to the hides. That's where they would keep the oros. And at the end of the day, after the offerings were all brought, they would divvy up the oros amongst the Kohanim. Now, the zchus of the Kohanim to take home the hides of the karbonos is actually almost explicit in the Torah in Vayikra Perek Zayin, and the Gemara in Zvachim on Daf Kuf Gimel derives that this parasha applies to Kodesh Kadoshim, Kodshei Kodshim. As far as Kodshim Kalim are concerned, which can be eaten by the Bailan, even though they're not Kohanim, they get the hides. But with regard to Kodshei Kodshim, like Ola, Chatos, and Osham, the Torah designates the hides for the Kohanim. And this was placed in a room which is on the Tzad Daram of the Beis Hamikdash. It was actually in the Kodesh, in the Azara, but towards the outer parts of the Azara, and that's where they would put the oros for the Kodshei Kodshim to be designated for the Kohen. It was called Parva because the name of the person who actually contributed the money was Parva. La'erev hayu mechalkim osam li'anshe beis ha'av. You know that the avodas hakarbonos was divided up into mishmaros, and there were 24 mishmaros. Each mishmar received a week during half the year, another week during the other half of the year, all told 2 weeks. And within each mishmar, they divided up into what's called bate avos. And at the end of the day, the Beis Av that had that day's responsibility would receive the oros. However, unfortunately, as I said, this is a painful agadita. And by the way, you know, the mishmaros, I told you that there were 24 mishmaros. That's not always historically the case. At the time, Moshe Rabbeinu, there were only 8 mishmaros. But later on, during the time of the Navi, of Shmuel, and Navi, and also Melech David, they divide up the mishmaros into 24 mishmaros. Each one, as we said before, had a week during half of the year, another week the other half of the year. And then they divide up each mishmar into 6 batei av. Hayu balei zroos notlin osan bizro. Unfortunately, there were some tough Kohanim, strong-armed Kohanim, as we call it, and they would actually take by force the hides of the animals, and other Kohanim who weren't as aggressive, they weren't strong-armed, they lost out. So as Kinu, they looked for a solution, and they made a takana, Shiyu Mechalkin Osam Me Erev Shabbos Li Erev Shabbos, that they would delay the chalukah of the oros. Instead of on a daily basis, they'd wait till the end of the week on Friday, and then the entire Beis Av and basically one of the mishmaros would be overseeing and supervising the division of the hides in such a way that no one would be able to take more than his share. And that's called the Asyon Kulu. They would all come, mishmaros, v'shaklan ba'adadi. They would take it together, and in such a way, they would prevent these tough guys, these balei zro, these strong-armed men, from taking more than what's coming to them. V'adayin hayu gedolei kuhuna notlin osan bizroa. But unfortunately, even when the mishmeres would divide up together as a group, the oros, they still were afraid, not so much of the balei zroa, those who were really tough and aggressive, but of those Kohanim that had a special status. Apparently, there was a whole hierarchy of Kohanim, and the Kohanim of special status would say, you know what, we deserve to take the Oros, and they would take more than their share again. And at that point, when it became quite famous and well known that this was going to be a problem, Omdu Bailim Vikdishim Lashamayim, the only thing they could do to make sure that it wasn't a situation where X number of Kohanim would grab more than what's coming to them, is they would be makdish the Oros as Hegdesh. And now the Kohanim would realize this is Hegdesh, and we cannot take the Oros. So this is the arrangement that eventually evolved over the course of time to make sure that this would not happen, this would not occur. Amru, even after this new takana evolved, that the Balei HaKorbanos were magdish the Oros, lo hayomim mu'atim, even a short time later, ad shechipu es ha'heichal kulo v'tavlo shel zav. Interesting. As a result of this entire situation, what evolved was that the Beis HaMikdash became quite wealthy. Why is that? Because once the Bailam were makdish the Oros, and apparently the Oros would sell for a high price, and especially if there's massive amount of korbanos, then the Gizbar would sell the Oros on the open market, that's called pidyon, and the money would go into the treasury of the Beis HaMikdash. So I had this excess amount or assets of funds, and what they did was they used this money to make gold-plated tavlos. The tavlos were the parts of the doors and the gates, and they were gold-plated. Shein amal amo ke'ovi dinar zov. They made these plates that were 1 amma width and 1 amma height, with a thickness of a dinar shel zav, of a golden coin. And this really created a situation where people felt very much in awe of the Beis HaMikdash. However, after a period of time, the entire Kodesh was covered with these plates, and l'regel hayu mekaplin osan, u'menichin osan al gav maila behar habayis. When it came to the regel, and many myriads of Jews were coming on Aliyah l'regel, what they did was they would peel off the gold-plated parts of these plates, and they would put them in the Chel Noshim, which is where they had the 15 steps that would lead all the way onto the Azorah. And these gold plates were now placed on the stairway where they had these 15 milos, Keneged the Shir Malos, Kedeshu Ole Regolim Roim Shemalachtam Noah V'Ein Ba Delet. So that now the Ole Regolim would be so in awe, seeing that the beautiful umnus and the dedication of the umnim of all these professional workers, and whatever they did was to beautify the Beis HaMikdash. And Ein Ba Delim. Delim means dofi. There were no flaws in them. So this would all intensify that wonderful feeling of awe of the Beis HaMikdash. Tana, we learned in a Brisa, Abishol Omer, Koros Shel Shikma Hayu B'Yericho. There were sycamore trees in Yericho, and Koros are the wood that they would take from these sycamore trees, from the trunks of the trees. And unfortunately, the owners of these sycamore trees in Yericho were not able to withstand or defend themselves against these strong-armed men who would want to just abscond and steal their beautiful wood from the sycamore trees. Again, a similar story in which the Bailam said, you know what? There's only one thing that I can do to prevent these Bali Zroa from taking away my Koroshel Shikma, and that is to be Magdish L'Shamayim. That far they won't go. They won't steal it from Shamayim. That's Me'ilah, and that would be punished by the law in a very severe way. So once again, the treasury of the Beis Hamikdash is gaining from this whole situation. And Aleim Val Kayotze Behen, Omar Abba Shol ben Botnis, Mishum Abba Yosef ben Chanin, Oili Mi Beis Baitus. Now, at this point, the Gemara is mentioning a whole bunch of families that controlled the institution of the Kahuna, especially the Kohanim Gedolim, during the period of Bayis Sheni. And so many of these people, unfortunately, during that period of time, were Rishoyim. They were evil people. They were Bali Zroa. One of them was called Baitus. Oili mi beis Baitus. Woe to me because of the family of Baitus. And again, these were people who apparently used physical force to terrorize other Jews, to extort money from them. Oili me'alosan. Alosan is a kind of what we call today mace, M-A-C-E, if you know. And these are strong weapons and clubs that they use. Oili me'alosan, oili mi beis chanin, another family. Oili mi lechishasan. Lechishasan literally translates as whisperings. And what happened was the whisperings, meaning this Beis Chanin, this household, was known for their counseling of evil against their other fellow Jews. Oili Beis Kasros, another terrible family. Oili Mikul Muson. Apparently, these members of this family would write letters against Jews and get Jews into trouble. That's called kulmusim, their pens. The kulmus is a quill. Oili mi beis Yishmael ben Piochi. And apparently this Yishmael ben Piochi was a person who was surrounded by people, members of his family, who were evil people. He himself was not a bad man, but his cohorts were. Oili megrofan, their fists, that's how aggressive they were. And Shehem Kohanim Gedolim. Amongst these families of Baisus, Chanin, Kasros, and Yishmael ben Piachi, many of them reached the highest level, which sometimes was appointed by the Malchus, as Kohanim Gedolim. Ubneim, and they appointed their sons as Gizbarim, as the treasurers of the temple. V'chasneim, and their sons-in-law, Amarkalin. Now, what's Amarkalin? Amarkalin is two words together, Omar Kulo. He said everything. In other words, the sons-in-law had control over everything that went on in the Mikdash. Whatever they said went. The Avdeim, and they had servants. Chovtinas Ambamaklos, who would beat people with sticks. It's hard for us to imagine that such a terrible thing was going on. The corruption in the Beis Hamikdash during Bayis Sheni, even as far as the Kohanim Gedolim, who again would buy their positions from the government and they would oppress the people. And we have no surprise when we learn about the Agaditas of Churban by Sheni. Tanar Rabbanan. Now, in this next brisa that we're going to learn, the Azara, apart from being a physical location of the sanctuary of the Mikdash, it's understood as, perhaps metaphorically, as a personality, as a being, alive. Arba tzvachos sovcha Azara. The Azara itself cries out. Or maybe it means that the malachim who oversee the Azara cry out. 4 cries. Rishona Tzu'umikan b'nei Eli. So the beginning of corruption in the Mishkan goes back to Shiloh, the sons of Eli, who were guilty. Again, we don't know exactly what they were guilty of. I mean, the pasuk seems to indicate they were guilty of adultery, having taken away married women who came to Shiloh. But the Chazal say in the Gemara Shabbos, you may remember this, that we don't take that literally, but in any event, they were very mezalzel in the kodshim, and the women who came, they had to stay overnight because they wouldn't bring their korban chatas yoledes on time. So the Azara cries out about the Bnei Eli. Shetimu heichal Hashem. It's as if they contaminated the heichal of the Mikdash through their actions. Od Sofka, the second crying. Semikan Yisachar Ish Kfar Bar Koi. Shemachabed es Atzmo Machal Kodshei Shemayim. Another individual by the name of Yisachar was desecrating the Kodesh. What did he do? Apparently he served as the Kohen Gadol. Davi Korich Yodei, he would wear gloves, Bishirai, that were made of silk gloves. Reminds us of something that happened to the Jewish people in the war. The Ovid Avoda, they would do Avoda. Now, this was a total zilzul because they didn't want to touch the karbanos and the dam as if it was below their dignity. And moreover, it's a chatzitza between the Yadayim and the karbanos, which undermines and disqualifies the Avoda. Od Tzafcha Azara. Now we have the third crying out of the Azara. But now, at this point, Baruch Hashem, we crossed over to the good side, the optimistic side, the positive side of the Azara crying out. Su'u shi'arim rashechem. There were some bright lights in the Kahuna Gedola, even during Bayesheni. So, quoting the pasuk in Tehillim, let the gates open up. V'kanes Yishmael ben Pichai. Now, Yishmael ben Pichai was mentioned earlier. Oili mi base Yishmael ben Pichai, but that's a reference to the other members of his family that were corrupt, not he himself. He himself was a good guy. And to praise him, the Azara calls him Talmido Shel Pinchas. Now, again, he lived many, many centuries after Pinchas ben Elazar HaKohen, but it's as if he was a direct disciple of Pinchas. The Yeshamesh Bekuna Gedola, let him come in through the Shi'arim that opened for him, and he should serve as the Kohen Gadol, because he's the one who deserves to do so. The old Tzafcha Bazar Sushar Mashechem Ikonis Yochanan ben Narbai Talmido Shel Pinkai. Now the word Pinkai here is probably a corruption of the word Pinchas. And on the one hand, this Yochanan ben Narbai apparently was a good guy. I mean, the Maharsha says we don't know exactly who he was, But if the Azara is opening up the gates for him, he must have been a righteous person. But nevertheless, it seems from the Marsha that he served during a period of time in which, again, we only know his first name, Yochanan. The Gemara tells us in Masechet Brachos, you may recall this, that there was a certain Kohen Gadol by the name of Yochanan Kohen Gadol. He actually served in the Mikdash over the course of 80 years. And at the end, he became a Baitusi, or a Tztuki. And he went off the path. The Gemara quotes the pasuk, Al tamin atzmucha yom moscha. You can never be absolutely sure what you'll do at the end. So on the one hand, the Azara recognizes the 80 years of sincere service of this Yochanan, but on the other hand, instead of calling him the son of Pinchas, because at the end he became a Tztoki, it sort of perverts the word Pinchas, and instead calls him Pinchai. Amr alav al Yochanan ben Arboy shaya ochel shlosh meos agolim. Now the Gemara wants to tell you how much of the Kodshim he actually enjoyed, he ate when he served as Kohen Gadol. Now, it could be that the Yochanan ben Arboy here is referring to the entire family of Kohanim of Yochanan, because otherwise it's hard to believe these numbers. 300 agolim, shosa shloshmeos garbe yayin, and he drank 300 kegs of wine. The ochel arboim saw gozolos bekinuach sudo. He ate 40 saw of young birds for dessert. Again, it's hard to believe that he himself would have eaten all that. I don't know if it's humanly possible, but apparently he shared it with many of the Kohanim. Amru kol yomav shel Yochanan ben Arboy lo nimtza nosar b'migdash. Nosar means when they leave the basar, the carbon, past its allotted time, it becomes nosar, and they never found nosar. He worked it out perfectly, dividing up all of the basar, the karbanos, in such a way that it would all be consumed within its allotted time, and it would never become nosar. So this is all in praise of this Yochanan, and it seems, according to the Chassam Sofer at least, that he would actually share the basar karbanos not only with the Anshe Mishmar, but even with other karbanos, with other Kohanim. They were sort of like his guests, and he fed them whatever were the shirayim of the basar karban that wasn't eaten. Now, we spoke before about a person by the name of Yisachar Ish Kfar Barkai. Let's go back for a moment and see if we could find him. It says, is he on the list? Just one second. We have, no, I guess his name is not mentioned. At least I don't find it right now. But apparently he was one of those evil Kohanim Gedolim who would oppress people. What?
He's the one that wrapped his hands in the silk.
Oh, he's the one who, okay, I missed it. Sorry. Thank you so much, Steve. Let's go back to, see, I'm on the wrong page. That's my problem. Yeah. It says that just Karo Shel Shikma. Oh, there it is. This was the second of the outcries of the Azara, Yisachar ben Ish Kfar Barkai. So we said before he was mezalzel in the Kodshim by wearing those gloves. So the Gemara asks, "My salkabe, what happened at the end?" In other words, what was the punishment that he suffered at the end of his life? Amri, and they told us the following story, very gory story. Malko Malkus Aviyasve. Now this is during the period of the Beis Hashmonaim, and the king, that's called Malka, and Malchus as the queen, was sitting, and they were discussing which meat is superior, the meat of goats or the meat of lamb, of sheep. Malka Omar, the king, said, Gadya Yoi, that the meat of a goat, of a young goat, is superior to that of a lamb. Umalka Omar, but she said, Imra Yoi, that the lamb chops are superior to the meat of gedi, of goats, of a kid. Now, many of the Mefarshim try to find deeper meaning here, symbolic meaning, but on the surface level, at least it means they just wanted to know from the perspective of a chef or an expert in eating, which would they prefer? And this was a machlokes between the king and the queen as to which meat was superior. So we have now a debate. So what do they do to determine the debate? Omru, they said, you know what? Man mochech, who's going to determine which of us is correct? You know, which is superior, the sheep meat or the kid's meat? And the answer was Kohen Gadol. The most obvious choice to make that decision is let's confer with the Kohen Gadol, the Masechet Karbonos Kol Yom, because he's offering up the karbonos on a daily basis, and he gets to eat the meat of all the karbonos. Some karbonos are brought from seirim, from goats, others from lamb, right? From sheep, so why not ask a person like the Kohen Gadol who eats from the best of the best, because that's what they brought for the karbonos, the fattest goats, the fattest lambs. He'll know which is superior. He'll be the judge, and he will determine. Asa Iu, so this is Sachar ben Barkai, who is the Kohen Gadol, comes, and here we'll turn to Daf Nun Zayin Amud Beis. Achve biyode. Now, this Achve biyode means that he was mezalzel in the melech and the malka. He dismisses them. You know, this is what we call body language. The gesture that he made is, you know, like you're asking something that's meaningless, or something the answer to which is so simple. You know, he somehow was mezalzel to them. He was dismissive. Yisak litmina. Why is it that when the Torah commands us to bring a korban tamid, which is brought twice daily as a korban olah, the Torah requires that we bring it from a lamb? And if you're going to argue, that's what he says to the king, it was the king who said that gedi is better, right? Malka Omar Gadiyoi. So why did the Torah choose the sheep and not the goat? Now, the king obviously was put aback by this. He was insulted. Omar Malka, he declared, Since he's lacking fear of the Malchus because he was so dismissive, his conduct was offensive to the king. He's like a Morei b'Malchus. So it's bad enough that he disagreed with the Melech as far as which meat is superior, but on top of that, he was so mizalzel. Is nifsaku liyamine, cut off his right hand. Yoav shochad upaski l'smolit. He didn't want his right hand cut off, so he paid the executioner a bribe so that he would cut off his left hand. But the king found out about that. Shoma malko umaski liyamine, and he commanded that his right hand as well be cut off. Omer Rav Yosef, Brich Rachmana, blessed be HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the judge who executes punishment, the Ashkele li Sochar Ish Kfar Barkoi Limitrafse Minei Bahai Alma. He metes out the punishment to this Yishmael in this world, which is a message to other Kohanim that they better get their act together and respect with great awe the Kodshim and the Beis Hamikdash. And in addition, this is good for Yishmael himself because as a result, he would be able to, I said Yishmael, I meant to say Yisrael, he would be able to come to Olam Haba with already a kapara. He's already suffered his atonement in this world. Omer of Ashi Sochrish Kfar Barkai Lo Tana Maslisin. In addition to his Averos and so forth and so on, his Zilzul in the Beis Hamikdash, he also didn't know a Mishnah. And we'll soon see he didn't even know a Pasuk in Chumash. That's how ignorant he was. Again, this is all indicative of the fact that the Kahuna Gedola was sold to the highest bidder, but they weren't scholars. And the Mishnah says the Snan. Now, I'm not sure if this is a Mishnah, but anyway, it's a Gemara in Krisus, a Brisa. Reb Shimon Omer, Kvasim Kodmim Li'izim Bechol Makom. So in other words, when you look in the Psukim in the Torah, you'll always see the Keves before the A's or the Sa'ir. So Yocham of Nation Muvcharim B'Minam, the Brisa asks, does that mean because these are superior, the lamb is superior to the goat? Talmud Lomar, but let's look at this pasuk. It says, Im Keves Yavi Karbana. Now the Im of Im Keves, which means if he brings a lamb, is coming to teach me, Melamed, Sheshneim Shkulim Kiechad, that they both have the same status. And apparently, this Yisachar was unaware of this price. Ravina Omar Afilu Mikra Nami Lokar. He didn't even know a pasuk. The pasuk says, Im Keves Im Eis. So if you take a look in Vayikra Perek Gimel, you will see that the Keves comes before the Eis. So it's not true that the lamb always comes before the goat. Iboy Keves Laise, Iboy Eis Laise. Whatever you prefer, whether it's a sheep or a lamb, that's what he should bring. And if I'm not mistaken, I don't have a chumash here. This is in the context of Korban Shlomim. So the implication here, says Rashi, is that the two species are equally acceptable. So even the pasuk contradicts this Yisachar. Very interesting that this is how we end Perek Makom Shenagu. I mean, a little bit on a down note. And now we begin Tamid Nishchat here on Daf Nun Ches. So this gives us a little bit of an opportunity to make it easier for ourselves by getting a far on Nun Ches. But first, a few words of introduction. As we mentioned earlier, daily they brought 2 Karbanos Ola as Karbanos Tzibur, Tamin Shel Shachar, Tamin Shel Ben Arbayim. And these were the sandwiches, so to speak, opening the Avodah, the Mikdash, with the Tamin Shel Shachar. That would be the first carbon that would be brought, and closing the day with the carbon Shel Ben Arbayim. And now Mishnah is going to discuss exactly when the carbon Shel Ben Arbayim should be brought. But most of this perek is an introduction to the carbon Pesach itself. We're going to start with a sugya that carbon Pesach is very exceptional. There is no carbon other than the carbon Pesach that is brought after the Tamin Shel Ben Arbayim. Tamin Shel Ben Arbayim, as we said, closes the day. That's called Hashlama. Oleha Hashlim Kol HaKarbos Kulu. But the carbon Pesach, we're going to learn from Sukkim and derive the exception to the rule that this carbon Pesach, comes after the Tamin Shel Ben Arbayim. Now, what's unique about the carbon Pesach is that the entire thrust of the carbon, its agenda, its purpose, is achila. And the Torah commands us, v'achlu es habasar b'layla hazeh, that we have to eat the meat. So that if you'd have a carbon Pesach and there's no one there who can eat the meat, let's say, for example, you had a chabura and all the members of that registered group who were meant to eat the carbon Pesach were all psulim. They were tmeim, or they were arelim, they weren't circumcised. In such a case, the whole carbon is out. It's completely invalid because the purpose of the carbon is for achil. Now, someone who's tameh and can't bring the carbon on the 14th of Nisan, we give him, as you know, a second chance, which is called Pesach Sheni, on the 14th of Iyar, a month later. The achila of the carbon Pesach, as we said, is a mitzvah, and many of the dinim of achila that apply in Kol Atar Kula will apply to the carbon Pesach. You'll need a minimum of a kazayis. Also, the carbon Pesach should be eaten al asova, the way a king would eat it. There's certain dinim of glorifying the achila of the carbon Pesach. So, without further ado, we start the Mishnah. Tamid nishchat b'shmona u'mechza. So if we divide up the day into 2 halves, the morning and the afternoon, or the morning and the evening, we could call it, Boker and Erev. So the morning ends 6 hours after sunrise, and that means the end of the 6th and the beginning of the 7th. And then we have another 6 hours, which is the Erev, that takes us from midday until Shkia, until sunset. Now, if we were to divide up that 6-hour period in such a way that we leave 1 hour in the middle for the Tamid, and I'm talking again about the Tamin Shel Ben Arbayim, then we could take 2.5 hours. That means the 7th and the 8th, halfway into the 9th, and then another 2.5 hours at the end of the afternoon, and then you'd have 1 hour right in the middle, which usually when it's a carbon tzibur, we need to designate an hour for that carbon because there are many parts of that carbon. So the Mishnah says, Tamid nishchat b'shmona u'mechza. And v'karev b'tisha u'mechza. In other words, from the time of the shechita of the carbon until we finish that krava is 1 full hour. So if we start at 8.5, then we'll be able to complete the tamid by 9.5. And this is true for the entire year, with the exception of 1 day in the year, and that's Erev Pesach, on the 14th of Nisan. And we'll have to understand why, but the Mishnah establishes that the Arvei Pesach Nishchat B'Shevo Mechza, the Karev B'Shmonu Mechza. The entire process of the Tamin Shel Ben Arbayim is implemented 1 hour earlier than it normally is. And that again has to do with the fact that, as I said before, the Korban Pesach is brought after the Tamid. And there is a major volume of Karbanos Pesachim that have to be brought. We need that extra hour in order to fit it all in on that very, very tight 14th of Nisan in the afternoon. So we're going to start the Tamid Shel Ben Arbaim earlier by 1 hour. Bein Bechol, Bein B'Shabbos. And it doesn't matter whether Erev Pesach falls on a weekday or on a Shabbos. The Pesach is brought after the Korban Tamid, and therefore we have to schedule the Tamid 1 hour earlier. And even if the Pesach is brought on Shabbos, now if we're talking about Erev Pesach, Shechalios b'Shabbos, then the law is that we override Shabbos for the sake of the Korban Pesach. Now, normally, on a weekday, we would postpone and delay the Korban Shel Ben Arbaim to allow for a vast volume of Korbanos, which are called Nidarim and Nidavos. But there are no Nidarim and Nidavos on Shabbos. So in effect, when Yudalid B'Nisan coincides with Shabbos, then the Tamid Shel Ben Arbaim could be brought earlier. The Mishnah says that the Korban Tamid Shel Ben Arbaim is brought on the 14th at 7.5 hours, and it matters not whether it's Shabbos or a weekday. And let's call it a kind of a low plug to equalize and make it uniform. Then even though theoretically we could have started the whole process of the Korban Pesach earlier by starting the Tamid Shel Ben Arbaim earlier, being makriv that much earlier, because there's no need to delay it because it's Shabbos and there's no Nidarim and Nidavos on Shabbos, but nevertheless we're going to keep it at 7 Umechza. Chal Erev Pesach Lios be Erev Shabbos. So now the 14th of Nisan is on a Friday. Now what that means is that we're going to need extra time for the Pesach on the 14th, on that Friday. The reason for that is because after the entire Hakrova, the Korban Pesach, whatever is necessary, then the meat of the Korban is divvied amongst the members of the Chabura, and each one takes it home, and he has to roast it, because the Torah commands us in the mitzvah of Tzli Eish. But that mitzvah of Tzli Eish does not override the Shabbos, so that it's critical that we fit in on that very busy Erev Shabbos, the 14th of Nisan, not just the Akrovas HaPesach, but also the Tzlias HaPesach. And in order to facilitate that, Nishchat b'Sheishu Mechza, we're going to start the process of the Tamid Shel Ben Arbaim at the earliest possible time, which is called Sheishu Mechza. We need that extra half hour from noon in order to make sure that the sun is tilted towards the west, and we didn't make any mistakes, on a cloudy day or so forth. They didn't have clocks in those days. So as early as noon, meaning a half hour after noon, they already brought the Tamid Shel Ben Arbaim, giving you all that extra time to facilitate on that Shabbos of Erev Pesach, on the Friday of Erev Pesach, to facilitate the Tzlias HaKarban before nightfall. Because again, once Shabbos enters, it's too late to roast the Karban. It's not Docha Shabbos. The Kari B'Shavu Mechza, so we give it a full hour. Va Pesach Achram, and immediately at that early time, relative to the rest of the year, we will begin the Hakrova of the Korban Pesach. The Gemara asks me, Nani Mili, how did the Mishnah know to establish that the Korban Tamid Shel Ben Arbaim is brought at 8.5 hours? And now the Gemara is assuming that this choice of 8.5 hours is D'Oraisa. Amar Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, I'll show it to you in the pasuk. Why? The Amar Kras HaKeves Achad Taseh Boker, V'Yes HaKeves Hasheni Taseh Ben Arbaim. So we have this phrase called Bein Harbayim, which literally translates between the afternoon. It's a very ambiguous statement. So what do we do? Chalkeu lebein shnei harbayim. According to Rabbi Yeshua Levi, the Torah is mandating that we take the Erev that starts noon and ends 6 hours later with Shkia, and we divide into two Erevs. There's the first Erev and the second Erev, with the Tamid right in the middle. And as we said before, we need a full hour for the Tamid. So that's how we arrive at 8.5 hours, because we allow for 2.5 hours at the beginning of the Erev, that's called the first Erev, and then the hour for the Korban Tamid, and then another 2.5 hours for the second Erev. Chalkeu l'shnei bein harbayim. Shtei shos u'mechza l'kan, shtei shos u'mechza l'kan, v'shah achas l'asiyos. Mosiv Rava, are you telling me, Rabbi Yeshua, that the halacha is doraisa, the requirement of bringing the Korban Tamid at 8.5 hours is an absolute, unconditional requirement that we derive from the pasuk Bein Harbayim, is bi'arvei Pesachim? The Mishnah establishes that on Erev Pesach, on the 14th of Nisan, is nishchat b'sheva u'mechza v'karev b'shmona mechza. We begin the process of the Korban Tamid 1 hour early. Bein b'chol, bein b'shabbos. Isa gedaktav b'shmona u'mechza doraisa. If you tell me that the Torah requires that the Korban Tamid be brought at shmona u'mechza, is heichi makdemina. How could we make it an hour earlier on Erev Pesach? Elama Rava says no. Mitzvaso de Tamid mishinatu tzlole erev. In other words, we're going to say that Bein Harbayim means just what it means, noontime. The added phrase Bein Harbayim is going to tell us that we have to wait an extra half hour, because we have to wait till the sun is tilted towards the west, and we can begin to see the shadow from the sun when it's at its apex on the east. Is my timer, why do we wait until the shadows begin to lengthen, which is that extra half hour? And the answer is the Omakra Bein Harbayim. What does that mean, Bein Harbayim? Me idna demaskil shimshal l'ma'arif. From the moment that the sun tilts towards the west. And if it tilts towards the west, then we know we're up to Bein Harbayim. Hilkov. Therefore, since we really begin, or shall we say the time that's appropriate for the Tamid Shel Bein Harbayim begins at noon plus a half hour, therefore, b'shayimos hashana, on any other calendar date in the year other than the 14th of Nisan, the ikar nedarim u'nedavos, that we want to give ample time for all those voluntary karbanos, is therefore we're going to postpone the Tamid Shel Bein Harbayim, because again, as we're going to soon see now, Rava is going to interpret a pasuk to mean that the Tamid Shel Bein Harbayim has to be the last karban that closes the day of the Beis Hamikdash. So we have to delay it in order to allow for all the massive volume of Nidarim and Nidavos. That's a quote of the pasuk. And this pasuk in Vayikra Vav is the source for the mitzvah of Hashlama. Omar Mar, and he's going to quote somebody, we'll see later on who this is, Olea Hashlem Kol HaKarbonos Kula. On the Tamid, we should complete all the karbonos. And therefore, Ma'achrin La Tarte Shoy, we're going to postpone the Korban Tamid for 2 hours. So instead of half hour into the 7th, or what we call Sheishu Mechza, we're going to add 2 hours, and we're going to get till Sheva Mechza, V'avdinale B'shmonu Mechza. I added 1 hour, but 2 hours is Shmonu Mechza. And all that is for the rest of the year 364 out of 365 days in the year. But the Arvei Pesachim, the Ikon Pesach Achrov, on Erev Pesach, we need more time for the massive volumes of the Korban Pesach. Is therefore Kadmina L'Shah Achas. Instead of 8.5, we're going to do it at 7. Of course, it means we're going to have to pay a price for this. We're going to have to somehow limit the Nidarim and Nidavis. Erev Shabbos. Now we have a problem with Tzlias HaPesach when the 14th of Nisan is on Shabbos. On Erev Shabbos. And therefore the economic Tzlias of the Lodochi Shabbos is therefore Makbina Le'adina B'Sheish. We're going to be makdim it all the way up to Sheishu Mefza, the earliest time that the Torah allows the Korban Shel Ben Arbayim, in order to facilitate bringing the Korbanos and still leaving time for the Tzlias HaPesach that has to take place in this case on Friday because it's not Docha Shabbos. Okay then, so this is where we're going to stop for today. In Mitzvah, we got a little far for tomorrow. Thank you so much.